Welcome to this channel. In this video, we are going to be talking about pollination and fertilization in plants. Now, you see, in order to understand what fertilization and pollination is, we have to first understand the fact that this process takes place in flowering plants because the flower is the reproductive part of the plant. The flower, we call it the reproductive part of the plant, and we call plants that produce flowers, we call them flowering plants or angiosperms. So angiosperms are plants that they are a group of plants that bear flowers. Of course, they are the alternate form is the gymnosperm. The gymnosperm. All right. Or we call them that's gymnosperm for short. Biologically, we call them gymnospermophyta, and this one angiospermophyta. So at the end of the day, we said the flower is the reproductive portion of the plant, of the angiosperm. So as you can see here, there is a picture of a flower here, which is what the plant uses to, um, for reproduction. Now, we have for a complete flower has two parts. It has the non-essential part, and of course, it has the essential part. So we have the non-essential and the essential part. Then, now in the non-essential part, we have the calyx, the corolla, the sepal, the petals. Now, the sepal has the major function of protecting the whole, the entire plant, the entire flower, when the flower is in just its bud stage. The flower develops from a bud. So in that baby flower stage, it is the sepal that acts as the you know the protective um, the protective layer that covers that bud. Now, group of sepals, the group of sepals are called calyx or calyces for um, plural, calyces, or group of sepals, singular, we call them calyx, and in plural, we have calyces. While a group of petals, we call them corolla. Corolla. So, the function of the corolla, basically, or the petals, actually, is to help in pollination. How does it help in pollination? It serves as an attractant. It serves as an attractant to pollinator. All right. One of the ways by which it does that is that at the base of the corolla, or the group of petals, we have what is called nectar. Is that okay? So this nectar is a sweet juice that pollinators such as insects, majorly insects, are attracted to, or birds, some birds as well. They are attracted to, and by coming to get, by trying to get this nectar, they get to um, get to um, you know they rub their bodies on the pollen grains, and those pollen grains that are attracted to them are by their by their moving from one flower to another, they get to transfer this pollen grain, which is called pollination. Then the essential part of the flower, of the complete flower, is are the androecium. Androecium refers to all the male reproductive structure, and genoecium, the word andro means male. The word andro means male. Anywhere you hear the word andro something, it refers to male, and geno refers to female. So for example, you hear words like gynecologist. So the word gene refers to female. Okay. So androecium, androecium is the male, um, all the entire male structure, while genoecium is the entire female structure. Now, the male structure are altogether called the stamen. They're called the stamen, while those of the female are called the carpels. The carpels consist of OSS, that is ovary, style, and stigma. the ovary, the style, and the stigma. Basically, the way you see them is in this order, in the upward order in the plant, in the flower rather. The stigma is the uppermost portion, then the style bears up the stigma, and the ovary is the basal portion or the enlarged portion of the base. Now, this stamen consists of the A, C, F actually, the anther, the connective, and the filament. Okay, the connective is basically the portion of the portion that connects the anther and the filament. The filament bears the anther, and the anther basically bears the pollen grains. The pollen grains are embedded in the anther. The anther is gotten from the Greek word anteros, and anteros means to bloom like a flower, blooming. So that is why, as an agent of dispersal, the anther can bloom in the process known as dehiscence. So we say the anther dehisces. The anther dehisces. Okay, we're going to get to that basic in further as in the course of this lesson. Now, complete flower. We have a complete flower has the stamen and the carpels. Remember, we said the carpels, the stigma, the style, and the ovary and the ovule. Ovules are embedded in the ovary. Is that okay? So the female reproductive organ of the flower is called the ovary, but the whole female reproductive structure or the entire female reproductive system comprises the stigma, the style, and the ovary. Embedded within the ovary is the ovule. And you know, in our former video, we talked about the arrangement of the ovule in the ovary is known as placentation. There is a special way in which these ovules can be arranged. Is that okay? So we call that condition or that process, we call it placentation. That is, placentation is defined as the arrangement or organization of the ovules within the ovary of the flower. Okay, so we say the style is a tube on top of the ovary and it bears the stigma. As you can see it, the stigma has sticky substances which helps it to hold in place the it helps it to hold in place the pollen grain. Now these holes you see here are the petals. These three here, they are the petals. Okay, now the anther is, remember the group of petals, remember we said they are called what? Corolla. And the group of sepals, so these ones here are, you see the sepal is reduced here, is reduced because the flower has become mature here, so the sepal no longer serve the function of protecting the flower. Remember when the flower was still a baby flower, so to say, the sepal was serving a protective function. But once the flower has matured, the sepal only function together with every other part in the process of function for photosynthesis, production of food, photosynthesis. So it functions for photosynthesis, for production of food for the plants. All right. So we said also that the filament holds the anther in place. And of course, within the anther, we have the pollens. Is that okay? So it contains the pollen, and the pollen are the reproductive cells. Is that okay? The male reproductive cells, while the ovules are the uh, they are the female reproductive cells now, and they are the one that become seed. We are going to get into that basically. Then the peduncle is the peduncle or stalk. Is that okay? Is the stem of the flower, because this is the point of its attachment to the branch on the plant itself. Then, so peduncle is the point of attachment, and there is a portion here known as the receptacle. So the receptacle bears all of these guys here, all the entire holes that you see on top of it here. Okay. So this slide is showing the structure of the filament and the style and the filament and um, the anther and the pollen grains within the anther. So you're going to see here, there's the anther, this whole structure. Now within it, you see pollen grains here. They are pollen grains. Now these portions here, they are called chambers. They are called chambers. and there is a connective between these filaments and the anther. So we call that portion the connective. And of course, this because the anthers are anchored in lobes. Is that okay? They are in lobes. Now, um, in the so this whole thing is called the androecium. That is the male reproductive system. Is that okay? That's the androecium. All right. So now, then there is the female reproductive system here, which is basically the carpels, the carpel, the carpel. Remember, we call those of the male the stamen and or androecium, and we call the both of those of the female the carpels, or the group of carpels. We call them genoecium. Is that okay? Group of carpels. Now, inside the ovary, I mean, the carpel consists of the top here, which is known as the stigma. The top here is known as the stigma. Now you're going to see the style. The style is this portion here, this portion here as the style. So you're going to see the stigma as taking pollen grains here, as accepted pollen grains, because it contains sticky substances, and those sticky fluids helps the pollen grain to stick to the surface of this. And as the pollen grains stick to the surface of this, it is going to absorb nutrients and water. It's going to absorb water and of course absorb nutrients from the surface of this guy. And because of that, that nutrient and water is going to allow it to begin to germinate. And the pollen grain will begin to germinate into what we call the pollen tube. So as you can see here, the pollen tube is beginning to germinate downwards. Okay. Now you see, the pollen tube germinates and enters through a portion here known as the micropyle. We're going to see that in the later slides. It's going to enter into the micropyle, through the micropyle, and then there are two nuclei in the two cells in the pollen grain. We have one that is called the two nuclei rather. We have one that is called the generative nuclei, and the generative, and we have the generative nuclei, and we have the tube nuclei. Now the tube nuclei is the one that migrates to the tip of this pollen tube that is germinating. That tube nucleus, the tube nucleus will migrate to the head of this pollen tube, the edges. You can see the edges as I'm marking them. So as soon as it migrates to the edges, then the pollen tube is able to grow in the right direction towards the micropyle here before it can now fertilize the egg in the egg cell in within the ovary. But basically, you can see the structure of the ovary, the carpel. You can see it starts with the stigma at the top here. We have the style that bears the stigma, and we can see within here we have the ovules. The ovules. Now, the placenta is what anchors the ovules to the attaches the ovules to the ovary. Is that okay? And the placenta, between this placenta and the ovule, is the funicle. Is that okay? Or we call it the funiculus. The funiculus is just between the the funiculus is between the placenta and the ovule. Is that okay? It's just for anchoring the ovule. All right. Now let's talk about pollination. Now, sexual reproduction in flowering plants was first studied by Camerarius. Now, that is just a brief history of the whole process. Is that okay? So, sexual reproduction in flowering plants was first studied by this man named Camerarius, and um, it is found that a whole or a verticille is an arrangement of sepals, petals, and leaves, stipules, or branches that radiate from a single point and surround or wrap around the stem. What that whole thing is just saying is that this portion here that you see here, this whole portion here, this whole portion here is what it's talking about. This whole portion, all right? So and of course he called it the whole. Is that okay? It's called the whole. So this whole portion here, as you can see in this guy too, It's called the whole. Is that okay? Or verticil. Now, the process of pollination is basically the process of transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of a flower. Now, this process can be achieved either by through biotic means or abiotic means. In the biotic means, we have living things such as insects being the one to assist in the transfer of pollen grain, while in the abiotic means we have wind or water as one of the make the pollinating agents or agents of pollination. Now, the process of pollination occurs only in angiosperms. Do you know an angiosperm basically? Now, you see, so there are two types of pollination in that wise. There are two types of pollination. We have the self pollination and the cross pollination. The self pollination and the cross pollination. So the cross pollination versus the self pollination. In cross pollination, you're going to see that there are about three different flowers here. So what happens is that the flower in one is going to the flower in one, which has anther, is going to um, dehisce, and by dehiscing it means it breaks open to release the pollens. Now, on release of the pollens will make it to the stigma of another flower. They make it to the stigma of another. Two types of pollination. We have the cross pollination and the self pollination. Okay, so the cross pollination is basically the transfer of pollen grain from one flower, from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower. While if a plant pollinates itself, we call it autogamy. Is that okay? Autogamy. When it does that, that is self pollination. That is self pollination. That is, it transfers pollen grain from its own anther to its own stigma. Usually, in plants that do this, the stigma, the anther, is usually born higher than the position of the stigma. So, because of that, pollen grain can fall, can easily just fall because the so it's called autogamy, while the cross pollination, the transfer of pollen grain from the anther of one flower to another, is called allogamy. Allogamy, all right? Allogamy. Okay, so that is that. Now, so we have the types of pollination. They are the autogamy and the gatinogamy. In self-pollination is also called autogamy. Self-pollination is also called autogamy. Now, what does auto means? Auto means self, and of course, gami means marry. Is that okay? Marriage, basically, marriage. So it means that self marriage. It means literally means self marriage. That is autogamy, self marriage. Now, what does that mean? It means we transfer pollen grain from the anther of one flower to the stigma of the same flower, to the stigma of the same flower. Now, the condition that favors this autogamy, that makes this autogamy most likely to occur, is called homogamy. And what that means is this: when the anther and the stigma ripen at the same time, when the anther and the stigma ripen at the same time. So that is what homogamy. So, and it's what is one of the conditions that favor autogamy, because if they don't ripen at the same time, of course, the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the same flower will not yield success if only one of the structures have matured without the other being matured. Now, there are two forms of gatinogamy. The first form is there are two forms of autogamy. The first one is gatonogamy, and the other gatinogamy actually, and the second one is cleistogamy. Now, the word gating Star is from the Greek. The word gating is gotten from the Greek word neighbor. Gating. The word gatinogamy is gotten from the Greek word gating, and gating stands for neighbor. So basically, what they mean is that we are transferring pollen grain from the anther of one flower to the stigma of the same of another flower on the same plant. Does that make sense? So there is the same plant. So a plant can bear more than bears more than one flower. So when two of those flowers pollinate one another, from the geneticist point of view, from the geneticist point of view, the process the the process is autogamy because it is still self-pollination because although the flower did not pollinate itself, it pollinated another flower, but it's still on the same plant. And from the geneticist view, all the flowers, I mean, basically, genetically, all flowers on a plant are the same. So, except if there is transfer. So, but for um, from an ecologist's perspective, an ecologist view geitonogamy as allogamy, as a form of allogamy, that is, as a form of cross pollination. And why is that the case? Because, of course, there are different flowers. So, an ecology views geitonogamy as a form of cross pollination. So um, the Christogamy is a condition in which the flower fails to open. In fact, the word Christogamy is gotten from the Greek word Christos, Christos, and Christos means close. Is that okay? It means close. So because of the flower as the flower is not open, so because of that, it is only able to self-pollinate. It's not opening up its floral part, its reproductive structures, so that cross-pollination can occur. So because of this reason, only self-pollination can occur. Now, what are the advantages? The advantage of cross pollination is that it maintains the parental character and is used to maintain pure lines of hybridization experiment and ensures seed production. What that means is that it ensures that if there is a particular if the kind of plant that is pollinating, the kind of flower that is pollinating is has very special characteristics that make it unique or um, that makes it attractive, that special characteristic will be maintained um, in the next generation, because the next generation is a pure line because it comes from the same parent, right? But the con is that new useful characters are seldom, and variability and adaptability to change, to environmental change, is reduced. So, and of course, that is one of the problem of sexual reproduction, of as sexual reproduction, because there is variability is reduced, and adaptability to environmental changes is very low, because of there's no new no new genetic no new genetic characteristic that will be found in that plant, since it's arising from the same parent. All right. So now, what are the contrivances? The flowers must be bisexual and both the sexes must mature at the same time. So that's homogamy. Now, and in some cases, flowers are bisexual and clistogamous, that is, remain closed. And in some cases, pollination occurs in bud condition before the flower even opens. So these are the contrivances bordering the orthogamy, the self-pollination. Now, what of cross-pollination? Cross-pollination, which is also called allogamy. Allos means another. Is that okay? Um, allos means another, I think. So, and gamy means marriage, as we said. So, it is the process in which pollen is transferred from anther to the stigma of different flower on different plants. And it's also called xenogamy. That's another name for it. In fact, xeno means different. Xeno means different. Okay, so what that means is that a different plant, but of the same species. So you must remember that it should be of the same species. Now, for um, some of the reasons why this allogamy takes place, um, some of those reasons are the dichogamy. I've explained all of these terms in the video where I treated the 80 about 88 terms in plant pollination, plant reproduction primarily. So I'll just talk about them briefly. We have dichogamy, decliny, echogamy, heterostyly, and self-sterility. So these are the reasons while the cross pollination occurs. Is that okay? So um, that's that. Then we have the pros is that One of the pros is that introduces genetic recombination and hence variation. So there's variation in the progeny. It means that the progeny or the baby will not look like the parent, exactly like the parent. So, and thereby it increases the adaptability of the offspring towards changing environment. Now, another thing is that new and useful, environmentally useful varieties can be produced. But one of the problem with it is that some undesirable characters may also into the race. It might also come in, all right? And it is highly wasteful because plants will have to produce a large number of pollen grains. All right, so the disadvantage of this cross pollination is that some undesirable characters may creep in, and it can be highly wasteful, especially when for example, if an insect wants to pollinate a flower, it does so um, it doesn't do so like intentionally. Is that okay? It does so unintentionally. It rubs on the pollen grain, and so pollen grains get attached to the body. So much pollen grains get attached to the body that by the time the flower flies up, the insect flies away from the flower, some of these pollen grains will be discarded. Is that okay? So by the time it makes its way into another flower, of course, of the same species, nature has designed it in such a way that the a particular type of insect is attracted to a particular species of flower, right? So, but by the time it gets to pollinate, it gets to you know, um, land on another flower. Some of the pollens that has been um, that were stuck to the body might have been wasted, right? So that's the reason why, of course, the plant has to produce a large amount of pollen. So now pollination begins when a grain of pollen lands on a receptive stigma. Okay, it ends when the pollen tube punctures the embryo sac. So pollination is from the landing of the pollen to on the stigma. When the pollen lands on the stigma, that's the beginning of pollination. Down to when the pollen tube that grows enters into the embryo sac, because immediately after that process is where fertilization begins. Is that okay? And we know here it is double fertilization that takes place. Okay, so we have the pollen grain contains two types of nuclei, which are the generative nuclei and the tube nucleus. Generative nucleus and the tube nucleus. Now, what kinds of things can move pollen from anther to stigma of receptive stigma? Number one is the wind. Number two, which is the abiotic. Number two is water, which is also abiotic. I also have the biotic component, which are the insects or even human, right? And birds too, birds. Now we have the generative nucleus here. I have the pollen tube. The tube nucleus. Now the tube nucleus, I said, is the one that migrates to the portion here and begins to trace the direction of growth of this. It leads the direction of growth so that the now what one of the things that the tube nucleus does is this: it is receptive to it is receptive to signals signals, chemical signals called synergids are produced by cells called synergids. Is that okay? The cells produce hormones that I think the hormones are also called synergid hormones. So those synergids are produced by synergid cells within the ovary, and that's chemical signal um, is what is what helps the tube nucleus to direct the growth of the pollen tube towards, so that it doesn't miss the direction. Is that okay? It directs the growth towards the pollen embryo sac. So pollen grain germinates. Is that okay? Into pollen tube. So this is called the pollen tube. This guy here is called the pollen tube. And the tube nucleus forms a pollen tube which grows down through the style. This is the style, this is the stigma, this is the ovary. So these are ovules inside the flower's ovary. All right. So now the generative nucleus divides the generative nucleus divides to create two sperms. So you can see the generative nucleus undergoes mitotic division. Basically, it undergoes mitosis and divides into two cells. Now, these are the two cells that are very important in the forming of what we call the endosperm when fertilization, the second fertilization, actually takes place. Now, this um, tube nucleus helps to lead this guy into the, so in this case it is leading directly downward. This slide shows that it is leading the pollen tube to grow into the embryo sac. So it has entered into the embryo sac here. Is that okay? So the tube nucleus continues to lengthen the pollen tube. Now the tube nucleus now degenerates once it reaches the ovule. Now immediately the tube nucleus enters the embryo sac. First, this portion here is called the micropyle. Micropyle. The word micropyle is gotten from two words. We have micro, which means small, and we have pile, which means gate. Is that okay? So this micropyle is the eye through which this guy penetrates, or the opening through which this guy penetrates, and immediately it penetrates the embryo sac through the micropyle. The tube nucleus degenerates so that each of these two sperms that were created here will one fertilize. One will fertilize the egg cell, and the other will fertilize the polar nuclei. The polar nuclei is what degenerates into what I called the endosperm the other time. Is that okay? What forms the endosperm? So the egg cell will be fertilized by this first sperm, the first one, and the second one will go and fertilize the polar nuclei. Let me go again. I said this guy, the two sperms continue downward of the pollen tube and eventually reaches the ovule. So inside the ovule, we are going to have that there are two cells. We have the egg cell, and there are actually three nuclei there. One, the egg cell nuclei, and the polar nuclei. The polar nuclei consists of two nuclei and the egg cell here. So this guy fertilizes the egg cell, while this guy fertilizes the polar nuclei. Remember, this one is aplontic, these two diplontic. So because they have a diplontic two-end or diploid cell, and an aplontic or haploid cell. So we create a triploid 3N, which is endosperm, right? And this guy here creates a diploid zygote after fusing with the egg cell. After fusing with the egg cell. All right, so now the next thing that you see happen is basically what I've said before. So the pollen tube has now grown into the embryo sac. So what happens? There are two sperms here. There are two sperms here. Remember that the pollen tube will disintegrate immediately. The tube nucleus rather will disintegrate immediately it gets here. The tube nucleus, it disappears. Okay, so the this is how fertilization now takes place. This is how fertilization takes place. This guy, the the pollen tube has now grown towards the has entered into the ovule. It's entered through the micropyle, like we rightly said, and of course, now it's bearing only two nuclei here, which are products of the mitotic division of the generative nucleus. Now the first one is going to this is called the egg nucleus or egg cell, and this one is the polar nucleus. You see that it is diploid, right? There are two cells here, right? And of course, these guys are haploids. That is one N, one N. Is that okay? So by the time these guys fuse, they are going to form a zygote. So the fusion of the sperm of one sperm cell with the egg cell forms the diploid zygote. Is that okay? Zygote. And the fusion of this guy and this guy forms one N plus two N. That was what I called three N, then which we call triploid. Is that okay? Triploid, the word tri means three. Ploidy refers to chromosome numbers. When we get to the genetics, we are going to explain more about that. But basically, it is triploid, and it is this guy that becomes the endosperm, while this guy is the zygote that becomes the embryo. Is that okay? And of course, this is how a fruit is given birth to. Is that okay? This is how a fruit is produced. This is how a fruit is produced. All right. Now let's talk about um, the fertilization process. So in summary, this is how the fertilization actually takes place. The You're going to see here, we'll begin from here. So you see that the ovary, there's transfer of pollen from anther to the stigma, okay? So, or from another plant to the stigma. So, the ovary basically first has ovules, and the ovule contain macrospores. Is that okay? Now, these macrospores, you know, are going to produce sex cells, and these sex cells are going to be the primary embryo sac nucleus. This guy is the primary embryo sac nucleus, but these sex cells are they are going to divide by meiosis, and they become okay. So by meiotic divisions, we have several nucleus that are created inside of these ovals, and of course, we also have synergy cells that gets created. The synergy cells are the ones that produce hormones that direct the direction of growth of this pollen tube. And of course, fertilization will now occur by the pollen tube first protruding this place. Once the pollen tube enters this place, which is called, this portion is called the micropyle, then what happens next is that the tube nucleus disappears, and the two cells that the generative cell you know the, that the generative cell divided into, they are going to fertilize. One will fertilize the egg cell and become the zygote, and the other will fertilize the zygote, which is the embryo that grows into a seed. And of course, surrounding the seed is going to be the endosperm, which is what nourishes the developing zygote. All right. So that is how the whole process takes place. And of course, the anther. So this is for the female product. This portion here shows the female productive structure, the female reproductive system, the how it undergoes changes during pollination and fertilization. Then for this next case here, you're going to see the male reproductive part here. Basically, the anther has pollen grains, and the pollen grains consist of microspores. The microspores divide meiotically into cells, right? These cells um, are the cells that we call these cells are the cells that we call the pollen grains. Is that okay, with their nucleus at the center? So this pollen grain will now divide into two cells, and those two cells that are inside it are going to be the generative cell and the tube cell. And of course, the tube cell is the tube cell is the one that directs the growth of the pollen tube, like I said, and the generative cell divides into two sperm cells, and these two sperm cells are the ones that are used in fertilization of the ovum. Okay, so in fertilization, it involves the fusion of the male gamete with the female gamete, and the phenomenon was first reported by Edward Strasburger, in 1894 was the first to report the phenomenon of fertilization in 1894. And the male gametes are brought to the egg by a pollen tube in a phenomenon known as siphanogamy. Now, siphanogamy is what explains how. Now, it's called siphanogamy because the word siphon kind of refers to a tube. Is that okay? A tube. So more like the same origin of it has the same origin as the word siphon. Is that okay? So it's more like talking about how that the pollen tube grows towards the direction of the eggs, the female eggs. So it grows in that direction. So that is, we call it siphonogamy. Now, The fertilization occurs in four main stages. Fertilization occurs in four main stages. Now, the first stage is where the germination of pollen tube, um, the pollen tube that landed on the stigma, they begin to germinate and grow. The pollen grains begin to germinate into pollen tube, and of course, the second stage is the growth of the pollen tube downwards, and the movement downwards, and of course, the pollen tube will now enter into the embryo sac. Then the next is the fusion of the gametes. Okay, so this shows the stages, the steps involved. So we're going to see where by meiosis the microspores are created, and of course by uh, mitosis the generative nucleus becomes, by mitosis the generative nucleus breaks into the sperm cells. Is that okay? And of course, the tube nucleus also, which is the one that I said leads the pollen tube in germination. So, so then, of course, here too, it shows the pollen germination into the pollen tube, and of course, so this structure is the female gametophyte. So, and the pollen tube enters here. Of course, I said this portion is called the micropyle. Okay, so this is the embryo sac. This place here is called the embryo sac. And once it's enters, the tube nucleus disintegrates, and of course there is fertilization. The first cell, sperm cell, fuses with the egg cell, and the second fuses with the two polar nuclei to form endosperm nucleus, which is um, triploid, and zygote, which is diploid. So the same process as shown here, the same process as shown here. And then I said the antipodal cells are the cells that the functions are not yet defined, are not yet known to um, botanists. Is that okay? Now, double fertilization is the process. That process of fertilization in plants, in the flower there, is called double fertilization. Why? Because there are two fertilizations taking place. Number one, the fusion of the egg cell and the sperm cell to form the zygote. And number two, the second fertilization is the fusion of the second sperm cell with the polar nuclei. So we said the pollen tube enters the embryo sac at the micropyle. It's not micropyle, micropyle. And inside the embryo sac on male gametes, um, the male gamete fuses with the egg cell and form a diploid zygote. This is syngamy. Is that okay? Syngamy means fertilization, basically. The word syn means together, and gam means marriage, isn't it? So we know that is coming together, that is fusion. All right. So then the other male gamete fuses with secondary um, nucleus to form triploid primary endosperm nucleus, and the process is called triple fusion. That process is called triple fusion. The process that produces triploid cell is called triple fusion. So the occurrence of these two, the syngamy and triple fusion, um, in angiosperm is all called double fertilization, and it was first reported by S.G. Nawaskin. So um, this is the life cycle of an angiosperm displayed here, of course. So I've covered basically what we should cover here. Now, what are the significance? The significance of double fertilization. The female gametophyte stops its growth at 8 nucleated stages, and further growth continues after double fertilization. So the ovary, the style, and stigma, and all of those, they stop their growth at this stage, and of course, you know, um, double fertilization takes place, after which they now begin to grow again. Then the syngamy leads to diploid cell, which later changes into embryo, and triple fusion leads to endosperm, and which provide nutrition for the developing embryo. Don't forget that the endosperm nourishes the embryo. Endosperm nourishes embryo. Okay, then the secondary nucleus stops division before fertilization. So the triple fusion includes a dormant nucleus um, after, so that dormant nucleus will now regain its division power. Then is after the fusion, that the completion of meiosis will now take place. Then the formation of endosperm is mainly related to its need, which arises after fertilization. So embryo needs to be formed because of the nourishing of the zygote of the embryo. All right. So post-fertilization events. Now we have the post-fertilization events. Now, the calyx and corolla are available, but after fertilization, they fall off. Before fertilization, they were available. The calyx, that is the sepal, and the corolla, that is the group of sepal petals. I covered other terms in that 88 terms. So make sure you see that video. I'm going to link it down in the description because I talked about the fusion of, when the corolla is fused, we talk about gamopetalous. When the calyx are fused, gamocephalous. All right. Then we have, so after fertilization, basically the fall off, androecium and style are present before fertilization. They fall off after fertilization. Stigma is present, it falls off after fertilization, but ovary turns into fruit while the ovule turns into seed. Then the ovary wall turns into the pericarp, which is the portion that we can chew in some fruits. So the pericarp consists of the endocarp, the mesocarp, and the epicarp. We're going to cover that in the fruits. We're going to cover that in fruits. Then the not integument becomes the seed coat. The outer integument becomes the testa of the seed. The um, the inner integument becomes the tegment, and the micropyle remains the micropyle. The funicle becomes, it's the funicle that attaches the placenta and the ovule. So it will become the stalk of the seed because the ovule has become the seed, so it will be the stalk of the seed. So then the egg cell becomes the zygote on fusion with the sperm, and the synergid disintegrates or disappears. All right, so this will be it for this video. Thank you for seeing the end of the video. Do want to subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification to get notified whenever I drop contents like this. Of course, I'm going to go through question and answer session on this topic. Do want to see that video too. God bless you.